first two sections on ancient Greece, and let's talk a little bit about what you'll be reading about. First of all, if you look on the map on page 101 up at the top, you can see that Greece is a peninsula. But look at how ragged the edges are. It's not a nice, smooth, round peninsula sticking out. It's got a lot going on there. And the island of Crete that you see under Greece in the map is part of Greece today. So there's Greece sticking out like a peninsula. You can see that up above it are going to be, it's sticking into the Mediterranean, so Europe's on the top, underneath it will be Africa, and to the side is Asia Minor, part of the Asian continent. So it's really in a very interesting place. It has easy access to Europe, Asia, and Africa. So let's take a look at how they started. The earliest culture we know about on this island is called the Minoan culture. We don't know what they called themselves, but they have been named the Minoan by people who discovered the culture. And it says here that their culture was based on trade. And this culture existed on the island of Crete. So why would their culture be so apt to be involved in trade?
Because they're an island.
They're an island and they have to sail everywhere, so why not sail to Africa, you know, to the European coast, to Asia? They had such good access, so they started spreading goods around the Mediterranean, so it was based on trade. Now, what we found is their old palace at Knossos. The rulers of this trading empire lived in this big palace, and if you look on page 103 at the top, that shows a fresco from that palace, and look at how wonderful the art is. So they must have had their lives well organized. They had traders, they had people doing different crafts. How do I know this? How do I know when I see such beautiful art that they had an organized civilization? We've studied about this. Why would I know if I see a society that has great art, how would I know that their people were organized into different jobs?
Because they had teachers or artists, they needed teachers.
Okay, they had artists. And can artists exist in a culture that's just wandering around looking for food to survive? No. They exist in a civilization. The artist needs to eat. He can't do his art if someone's not farming and feeding him. He can't do his art if someone's not making his shoes. He would have to do all that himself. But by the fact that we see such exquisite art, now this was painted on a fresco. Do you know what a fresco is? Anyone? Okay, when you hear about painting on a fresco, F-R-E-S-C-O-E, it's when an artist paints on wet plaster and they have to work fast. You can't like fix your mistakes. You have to paint quickly. The paint will soak somewhat into the plaster and then it dries. So when you see these frescoes and they look so good, you know that that was a very competent artist who painted that fresco. And this palace was full of them. So they had arts. So they cared about beauty. Why do I say that? Why do I say they cared about beauty?
Say it art.
And their temples were decorated. Their palace was very beautifully decorated. They had religious shrines to honor their gods and goddesses. And it said that frescoes were all over. And we learn about what their culture was like from these frescoes. On the bottom of page 102 it says, these frescoes tell us much about Minoan society. Leaping dolphins, as you saw, reflect the importance of the sea. Religious images indicate that they worshipped a bull and a mother goddess. Other paintings show young men and women strolling through gardens or jumping through the horns of a charging bull. Well, there's a nice game for you. Have an angry bull charging at you with his deadly horns pointing at you, and your job is to be missed by the horns. So they had some interesting kinds of sports. But this civilization totally disappeared. And we can tell or the archaeologists can tell that there was nothing for a while. We don't know why it disappeared. This is another one of those mysterious civilizations like the Olmecs. And it says that they just disappeared around 1400 BC and they vanished. Now, why? We're not sure. It says a sudden volcanic eruption on a nearby island may have rained a flaming death on them. They didn't have the volcano, but it could have affected them. It could have been followed by a tidal wave. However, invaders certainly played a role in the destruction of their society. Now, the intruders that came next were the Greek-speaking people called Mycenaeans. And you're going to learn something interesting in this chapter. The Mycenaeans now are going to be the rulers of Crete. How many of you have ever heard of the story of the Trojan War? You've heard of the Trojan War. How did the enemy get into Troy in the Trojan War?
The big wooden horse.
Okay, how dumb to accept a gift like that from your enemy, but the horse came in, the soldiers came out, and Troy lost. The people in that story were from this island. They were Minoans. They were Greeks, but they were the, I'm sorry, not Minoans, Mycenaeans. They were the Mycenaeans. And the Mycenaeans were great sea people again. The Mycenaeans lived in Crete, and there's the story about the Trojan War. Apparently, according to this story, the wife of the Mycenaean Greek king was beautiful. And let's see, am I getting this right? I know Paris stole a beautiful woman from Mycenae, and that started the war. Her name was Helen, and in poetry she's called the face that launched 1,000 ships, because 1,000 ships went to get her back. So she was so beautiful, she's called the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, we always liked this story. Does anyone know who told this story? Yes, Prince Paris from Troy captured Helen, the beautiful wife of the king, Mycenaean king. And who wrote all this story down? It was Homer. Have you heard of Homer? Okay, Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now these books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have had such an incredible impact on literature over the centuries. You cannot believe how many writers have been inspired by this story. And we're going to talk about it a little bit. But for right now, I want to tell you that we never believed it. We decided the Trojan War didn't happen. Homer just made up this glorious story because it's got gods in it and stuff, so it's just a bunch of bunk. But there was a archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, a German, who was excavating in the area of Troy, and he discovered all the indications of that battle at the time it was supposed to happen. And all of a sudden, we realized that Homer's story is based on a true event. We don't know how much of part of his story is definitely not true. I mean, the gods didn't come down and help, but the basis for his story was true. And we thought it was just a myth. But in the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann discovered that this was indeed an event that happened. And that was really fascinating. Can you imagine how many people who love the Iliad and the Odyssey were really excited? I mean, they were like, yeah, this is really based on truth. This is so cool. The Trojan War happened. We don't know exactly what caused it. He said it was Helen going with Paris. We don't know for sure if that part's true, but we know it happened. So now let's look at what's called the Age of Homer. You're going to be reading about him writing those stories and what they're about. It'll give you an overview of the Iliad and of the Odyssey, and some quotes. So that's the first section. M&Ms, Minoans, and Mycenaeans. Make sure you get them in order. Which comes first in the alphabet, I or Y?
I.
Okay, the Minoans, M-I, are first, and then the Mycenaeans, M-Y, come next. So you keep them in the right order. So you have the M&Ms and Homer that tells the story of the Mycenaeans. And that's your first section. Now the second section is going to tell you a little bit about the geography of Greece, but it starts getting really interesting here because this is where we start seeing the difference between different city-states in Greece. In particular, we're going to be reading about Sparta and Athens. How many of you know who the Spartans were? How many of you saw 300? Okay, that's based on a true story. Did you see it?
Yeah.
The Spartans. Who was the king of the Spartans in the movie 300? They always have two kings, but who was the one that fought?
Oh, shoot, what was his name?
Was it Leonidas?
Yeah, it was Leonidas.
Yeah, Leonidas. And anyway, those people are real. The story is based on truth. And we're going to be studying. Now, the Spartan culture is austere, strict. Everybody learns to fight. A woman's only value is to birth strong warriors, and if women are defective, they're killed at birth. The same with men. They only want the best specimens of humanity, and they're all about being warriors. The women have incredible athletic training as well. They are made really tough. Their little boys are taken away from them at age 7. I'd have to be awfully tough to put up with that. And so you're going to be learning about this culture that's so austere. Their houses are like just rough wood and a table, and nothing is sanded smooth or made with cushions for your comfort. Everything is tough. Everybody dresses the same. They have the same kinds of houses. Then you go to Athens. What do you have in Athens?
Luxury.
Yes, you have luxury. You have beautiful architecture in Athens. You have people dressed uniquely according to their style in the Greek style, but you know what fabrics they like. Boys go to school and they get an education in the arts and reading, writing, and oratory. Oratory was incredibly important. I teach public speaking to seniors, so you probably won't have that, but I teach public speaking to seniors, and it is a wonderful art. Out of all the classes I teach at this school, the thing that students have come back and said helped them the most was the public speaking. Because they go to college and all of a sudden you have to get up front all the time, and these students are mumbling and stumbling and they know exactly what to do. They always tell me, we had to take speech because you're required to take it in college. We had to take speech and we knew more than the teacher, they'll tell me, or we aced it, So they like that class, but oratory was the best thing in this period because there was no email where you could publish to everybody in writing what you had to say. The only way you could talk to a large group or get your message out to a large group was through oratory. So read about Athens, the architecture, the philosophy. The great philosophers come from Greece, and Athens was the center of that. We had great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle, the last one to live of those three, was the teacher of Alexander the Great, another famous Mycenaean Greek, and we will be reading about him as well. So what I want you to focus on in this part, when you read the second part, is the drastic difference between Sparta and Athens. I always say Greece had a multiple personality because they're so different. If you looked at those two cities to try and determine the personality of Greece, it would be rather confusing because they're so vastly different. If you look at our cities around the world, they might have unique traits or unique things like a certain stadium or a theater, but basically they're pretty similar. But here were two cities in Greece that were so different. They didn't think a lot of each other. The Athenians, of course, what do you think they thought about the Spartans?
Barbaric.
Barbaric, maybe. They were pretty polished warriors. You see them in battle with those pikes. They'd line up in their phalanx, and they had these pikes that were like 9 feet long that were counterweighted on the back, and they put them down between the shoulders of the guys in front of them, and they had a pattern. Then they start marching to you. It's like a bed of nails coming towards you. And if you're fighting by hand and you can't reach them because they've got this pike out in front, this is pretty formidable, right? So it was pretty creepy. But you're going to hear how amazingly they were trained. Now, if an Athenian went into that Sparta culture, what do you think is some of the things he might not think is so great?
Probably that they don't have any luxury.
They have no luxury. They have no beautiful buildings or houses. Now, the way the Spartans ate, because you can't do this and not have someone farming and feeding you, is they enslaved the Mycenaeans. It took them a long time because the Mycenaeans were warriors, but they became the slaves of the Spartans, and they had to farm for them and make their food and feed them so they could just concentrate on becoming soldiers. So look at what you're going to see, and we're going to look into it in a little more depth starting tomorrow. So when you come tomorrow, the first thing we're going to do is have a quiz on section 1 and 2. I'm not going to talk about it, so could you make sure you read it thoroughly and do your reading notes if you want to make sure you get a bonus point. And then we'll do the quiz, and then I'll start talking to you about some of the more fascinating differences between these two cultures. Any questions?
What section are we doing a quiz on?
Chapter 5, sections 1 and 2. 1 and 2. I can tell you that Greeks were so polished and sophisticated that I'm going to tell you about the origin of 2 words in our vocabulary. One is barbarians. If we say someone's barbaric, what do we mean? Just give me a basic idea. What do we mean if we say somebody's
They eat,
barbarian?
grossly, like maybe they're just like very rough.
Yeah, they're rough, they eat in a real gross manner, blah, blah, blah. They don't dress very polished. Okay, barbarian, that was from the word that the Greeks called all non-Greeks. They called non-Greeks barbarians. Another word we have in our language is sparse. We say something is very sparse when it's very minimal. Sometimes when I'm grading a board and it has like 3 pictures on it and a couple lines, I go, this was very sparse. In other words, it was just the bare bones. It didn't really cover the topic. Or we can say, I'm on a very Spartan diet. What does that mean?
Like you don't eat
Yeah, I don't eat a lot and it's simple, plain diet. I'm on a Spartan diet. So that came from, of course, the Spartans. So our word sparse and Spartan we use today came from the Greeks, and so does barbarian. I think that's all I'm going to cover for you today. So you do have a few minutes. I would like you to start reading through section 1, see what you can get done. If you're going to take reading notes, get that started. I'm going to come around and see what you're up to. So start on page 102, and your assignment is going to take you all the way to 109. Okay.